The Wyoming Territory in 1882 was no place for mercy. Winter came like a predator, devouring anyone foolish enough to believe they could survive on kindness alone. The smart folks barred their doors when storms hit and waited for spring to remind them what warmth felt like. But sometimes in the howling darkness of a blizzard that promised death, you hear something that changes everything. A cry that turns your blood to ice. Not from cold, but from the terrible recognition that somewhere out there, someone is dying alone. Martha Caldwell had been preparing for the worst blizzard in 20 years when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. Not the crack of timber or the groan of her barn, but something human, something desperate, something that would haunt her forever if she chose to ignore it. Picture this: a widow alone on 40 acres of stubborn Wyoming ground. 2 years passed bearing the husband who'd helped her claim this land. Martha had learned to read the sky like scripture, to recognize the difference between a storm that would pass and one that would kill. This one had death written in every cloud. She could have stayed inside, should have stayed inside. Every survival instinct screamed at her to bar the door and wait for morning. But that cry, that desperate wail cutting through the chaos, it sounded like hope dying in the darkness. What Martha found in that blizzard would test every assumption her community held about who deserved saving and who deserved love. Because the bundle she pulled from that snowdrift wasn't just any dying child. It was a Lakota baby wrapped in traditional blankets, bearing the sacred symbols of a people her neighbors had been taught to fear. This is the story of Winter Rose, the child who should have died but didn't. Of Martha Caldwell, the woman who thought her days of nurturing were behind her. Of a blizzard that became a bridge between communities at war for generations. You're about to witness how one act of compassion echoed across the Wyoming Territory, challenging everyone to question what they thought they knew about family, about loyalty, about the price of doing what's right when the whole world is watching. Martha had no idea that stepping into that storm would make her the center of a controversy reaching all the way to Washington. She didn't know that saving one baby's life would test community bonds, challenge federal policy, and prove that sometimes the most powerful force in the world is simply refusing to let someone die alone. All she knew was that somewhere in the darkness, a child was crying. And Martha Caldwell had never been the kind of woman who could ignore a cry for help, no matter what it might cost her to answer. The storm was coming, the choice was waiting, and everything was about to change. The wind came screaming across the Wyoming Territory like all the fury of heaven turned loose on earth. Martha Caldwell pressed her shoulder against the cabin door she'd just barricaded, listening to the storm claw at her shutters with fingers made of ice and rage. Snow drove sideways through the air, so thick it erased the world beyond her windows, turning familiar landmarks into ghostly suggestions. She'd been through enough frontier winters to recognize the signs of a killer storm. The way the temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour. How the air tasted of metal and danger. The peculiar silence that settled over the valley when every living thing with sense had gone to ground. This wasn't just weather. This was nature's way of reminding humans how small they really were. Martha moved through her cabin with practiced efficiency, checking supplies that would have to last until the snow melted enough for travel. The home she'd built with Thomas sat on 40 acres of ground they'd claimed when hope was still a luxury they could afford. 2 years since the rock slide had taken him, and Martha had learned the harsh lessons that separated the living from the foolish in this unforgiving land. The cabin was built to weather hell itself, thick log walls chinked with mud and moss, a stone fireplace that Thomas had built with his own hands, designed to heat every corner of their small sanctuary, windows placed to maximize light while minimizing heat loss. Everything calculated for survival when the world outside tried to kill you. Martha had just finished her final preparations when she heard it, a sound that made her freeze with her hands still on the water dipper. Faint at first, barely audible over the storm's roar, but unmistakably human. A cry. Weak, desperate, growing fainter, even as she strained to hear it again. She pressed her ear to the door, holding her breath. There. Again. Closer this time, but weaker. Something was out there in the storm. Something alive. Something dying. Every survival instinct screamed at her to stay inside. The storm would kill anything exposed to it within minutes. Whatever was out there was probably already dead, and she'd only be throwing her own life away for nothing. The smart thing was to wait until morning and bury whatever the storm left behind. But that cry, it wasn't the sound of a grown person caught in the weather. It was smaller, higher, more fragile. The sound of something that had never had a fighting chance against the world's cruelty. Martha's hand was on the door latch before her mind had fully decided. She wrapped herself in Thomas's old buffalo coat, pulled his wool hat down over her ears, and grabbed the rope she kept coiled by the door for exactly this emergency. She tied one end to the solid oak beam that supported her roof, knowing she had maybe 3 minutes before the cold killed her ability to function. The moment she opened the door, the storm tried to murder her. Wind hit like a physical blow, driving snow into her eyes and mouth, stealing breath from her lungs. The cold was so intense it felt like being slapped with a red-hot iron. She could barely see her own feet, let alone navigate by landmarks that had disappeared into white chaos. But she could still hear the cry, weaker now, coming from somewhere near the stand of pine trees that marked the eastern edge of her property. Martha followed the sound like a lifeline, one hand gripping the rope, the other shielding her face from the cutting wind. 15 steps from her door, she found it. A bundle of fabric half buried in a snowdrift, so small she almost missed it entirely. But as she knelt beside it, brushing away the accumulating snow, her heart nearly stopped. A baby. No more than a few months old, wrapped in what had once been a beautiful blanket woven with patterns she recognized but had never expected to see this close to her home. Lakota designs, traditional symbols worked in red and blue thread, now frozen stiff with ice and snow. The kind of craftsmanship that spoke of love, care, cultural pride, not the desperate improvisation of people barely surviving. The baby's lips were blue, breathing so shallow Martha had to press her ear to the tiny chest to confirm there was still life flickering inside. A girl, she realized, with dark hair that would have been beautiful if it wasn't crusted with snow and blood from a shallow cut on her scalp. Martha didn't hesitate. She wrapped the baby inside Thomas's coat, pulling the child against her own body heat, and followed her rope back to the cabin. The storm fought her every step, as if nature itself objected to this act of defiance against its judgment. Inside, Martha worked with desperate efficiency. She stirred the fire until it roared, filled her wash basin with warm water, and began the delicate process of bringing a dying child back from the edge. The baby's skin was mottled blue and white, her breathing barely perceptible, but there was still a flutter of pulse beneath Martha's fingers when she pressed them to the tiny throat. "Come on, little one," Martha whispered, rubbing the baby's limbs gently to restore circulation. "Don't you dare give up on me now." The baby's eyes fluttered open, dark brown, alert despite her condition, filled with an awareness that seemed too old for someone so young. She looked directly at Martha for a long moment, as if taking the measure of this stranger who'd pulled her from death's threshold. Then she began to cry, not the weak mewing Martha had heard through the storm, but a strong, healthy wail that filled the cabin with life. Martha felt tears she hadn't expected sliding down her cheeks as she cradled the child, offering comfort to someone who had no reason to trust any white face. As the baby settled into Martha's arms, accepting the warmth and safety being offered, Martha noticed the necklace around the tiny neck. A small medallion carved from bone, strung on sinew, bearing symbols that marked this child as someone important. Not just any Lakota baby, but one whose family would be looking for her. Martha looked out at the storm still raging beyond her walls and made a calculation that would have seemed impossible an hour ago. Whatever had separated this baby from her people, attack, accident, or something worse, the child was alive now, and Martha would keep her that way. "You're safe now," she whispered into the soft, dark hair. "Whatever happened out there, you're safe here." The baby made a small sound, not quite a coo, not quite a sigh, and curled her tiny fingers around Martha's thumb with surprising strength. In that moment, Martha felt something she thought had died with Thomas, the fierce protectiveness of someone responsible for keeping life safe and warm. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside, two souls from different worlds had found each other in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The storm raged on, indifferent to the small miracle taking place in a cabin that had been too quiet for too long. Martha had no way of knowing that this moment would echo across the Wyoming territory in ways that would test every assumption about who deserved to live, who deserved to love, and who deserved to be called family. All she knew was that the cabin felt alive again in ways it hadn't since Thomas died, and that holding this child filled spaces in her heart she'd thought were permanently sealed. The baby slept, and Martha watched over her, and outside the storm continued its assault on a world that had just become infinitely more complicated and infinitely more precious. Dawn came slowly to the Wyoming territory, filtered through clouds that promised more snow before the day was done. Martha had not slept. She'd spent the night in the rocking chair Thomas had made for her during their first winter, watching the baby breathe, listening to the storm gradually exhaust itself against her cabin walls. The child, Martha had started thinking of her as Rose, though she knew that wasn't her real name, had proven stronger than her appearance suggested. After that initial cry that had filled the cabin with life, she'd settled into the rhythm of a healthy infant, sleeping deeply, waking to eat the sweet and warm milk Martha had carefully spooned into her mouth, gazing up at her rescuer with those impossibly alert dark eyes. As gray light grew stronger, Martha studied the child she'd pulled from death's threshold. Rose was perhaps 3 or 4 months old, with the chubby cheeks and strong grip of a baby who'd been well cared for before whatever disaster had left her alone in a blizzard. Her hair was black as coal and fine as silk, and when she was awake, she tracked movement with the focused attention of someone already learning to read the world. The blanket told its own story. Even after being soaked and frozen, Martha could see the quality of the weaving, the careful placement of symbols that weren't just decorative but meaningful. This wasn't the work of desperate people making do with scraps. This was the product of a culture that took pride in creating beautiful things for their children, which made Rose's presence here all the more puzzling and troubling. Lakota parents didn't lose track of their babies. Lakota communities didn't allow children to wander into blizzards alone. Something terrible had happened to separate this child from her people. Martha rose from the rocking chair, careful not to disturb Rose's sleep, and moved to the window. She cracked open one of the shutters and peered out at a world transformed. The storm had left behind nearly 3 feet of fresh snow, sculpted by wind into drifts that reached halfway up her fence posts. Everything was still, not just quiet, but profoundly, almost supernaturally still. But this stillness felt different, expectant, like the pause between lightning and thunder. Martha was closing the shutter when she saw them. Tracks in the snow. Not animal tracks. She knew deer and elk prints well enough. These were made by horses and by people who knew how to move quietly even through deep snow. They led from the tree line to a point perhaps 50 yards from her cabin, where they seemed to circle and pause before leading back into the forest. Someone had come during the night. Someone had approached close enough to see her cabin, to note the smoke from her chimney, to observe whatever details could be gleaned in darkness. And then they had withdrawn, without attempting to approach or make their presence known. Martha's heart began to beat faster, but not with fear, with recognition. Rose's people were looking for her. They had followed some trail through one of the worst storms in memory, and they had found the place where their missing child had taken shelter, but they had not demanded her return. They had simply watched and waited, and left evidence of their presence like a calling card. Martha returned to her chair, lifting Rose gently as the baby began to stir. "Your people came looking for you," she whispered into the soft dark hair. "They know you're safe." Rose opened her eyes and seemed to study Martha's face with new intensity, as if she understood more than any 3-month-old should. She made a small sound and curled her tiny fingers around Martha's thumb with surprising strength. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do," Martha continued, finding comfort in speaking her fears aloud to someone who couldn't judge her. "I don't know if they expect me to bring you to them or wait for them to come for you." The truth was, Martha wasn't sure she was ready to give Rose back. In less than 12 hours, this tiny stranger had filled spaces in Martha's heart that she'd thought were permanently sealed. The cabin felt alive again in ways it hadn't since Thomas died. But wanting to keep Rose and having the right to keep her were different things. This child had a family, a culture, a destiny that had nothing to do with a lonely widow's need for purpose. The morning passed quietly. Martha fed Rose again, changed the makeshift diapers she'd fashioned from soft flannel, and talked to the baby about everything and nothing. She told Rose about Thomas, about the dreams they'd shared for this piece of land, about the children they'd planned to raise here before the mountains decided otherwise. Around midday, Martha heard what she'd been both expecting and dreading. Hoofbeats, multiple horses, moving at a steady pace through the snow. Not rushing, not fleeing, but approaching with the confidence of people who had every right to be where they were going. Martha went to the window and saw them clearly this time. 5 riders moving in formation that spoke of military discipline and shared purpose. They were dressed for winter travel, with heavy robes and fur-lined boots. But Martha could see enough detail to recognize Lakota winter clothing. The leader rode a paint horse whose breath steamed in the cold air. They stopped at the same spot where the tracks from the night before had paused. The leader dismounted and walked forward until he was close enough to speak without shouting, but still far enough away to demonstrate no immediate threat. "Woman of the cabin," he called out in accented but clear English, "we would speak with you." Martha's mouth went dry, but she forced herself to move with calm deliberation. She wrapped Rose in the warmest blankets she could find, checked that her rifle was loaded and within reach, and opened her front door. "I'm listening," she called back, stepping onto her small porch, but keeping the open door behind her as an escape route. The man who'd spoken was older than she'd expected, perhaps 50, with gray threading through his dark hair and the kind of weathered face that came from decades of living entirely outdoors. His eyes were sharp and intelligent, and when they focused on the bundle in Martha's arms, they softened with unmistakable relief. "You have our child," he said. It wasn't a question or an accusation, just a statement of fact. "I found a baby dying in the snow," Martha replied carefully. "I brought her inside." "Her name is Winter Rose," the man said. "She is my granddaughter." Martha felt something in her chest tighten at the confirmation. This wasn't some abandoned child who might become hers by default. This was someone's granddaughter, someone's family. "She's safe," Martha said, and her voice came out stronger than she'd expected. "She's been fed and kept warm. She's not hurt." The grandfather nodded slowly. "We know. We watched through the night. We saw your care." The simple statement hit Martha harder than any elaborate thanks could have. They had watched. They had seen her pacing with Rose, feeding her, singing to her in the darkest hours before dawn. "Will you?" Martha stopped, unsure how to phrase the question. "Do you want her back?" The grandfather was quiet for a long moment, studying Martha's face with the same intensity that Rose had shown. When he spoke again, his voice carried weight that suggested he was choosing words very carefully. "Winter Rose was traveling with her mother to visit family when there was an attack. White men, looking for horses. Her mother hid the child in the snow and led the attackers away. We found the mother's body yesterday morning. We have been searching for Winter Rose since the storm began." Martha closed her eyes, feeling the full tragedy settle into her bones. Rose wasn't just separated from her family. She was orphaned, her mother dead in an act of heroic sacrifice. "I'm sorry," Martha said quietly. "I'm so sorry for your loss." The grandfather nodded. "Her mother was brave. She died protecting what mattered most." "What happens now?" Martha asked. "Now we must decide what is best for Winter Rose. She is the last of her line through her mother, but she is very young, and it is winter, and our camp is far from here." Martha understood what he wasn't saying directly. Taking a 3-month-old baby on a long journey through winter conditions was dangerous, possibly fatal. "What if," Martha began, then stopped, afraid to voice the possibility forming in her mind. "What if she stayed with you until spring?" the grandfather finished. "Until she is stronger and the travel is safer?" Martha nodded, not trusting her voice. The grandfather looked back at his companions, and Martha saw a brief conversation conducted entirely in glances and subtle gestures. When he turned back to her, his expression had shifted from cautious assessment to something that might have been hope. "You would do this? Care for our child as if she were your own?" "Yes," Martha said without hesitation. "And in the spring, you would let her go back to her people?" This question was harder, but Martha forced herself to answer honestly. "If that's what's best for her, Yes. The grandfather studied her for another long moment, then walked back to confer with the other riders. Martha watched them discuss something in their own language, noting the respectful way the younger men deferred to the older one's judgment. Finally, the grandfather returned to his position and spoke again. We will make camp in the valley beyond the ridge, close enough to know Winter Rose is safe, far enough to not bring trouble to your door. When spring comes, we will return. Martha felt relief and terror at the responsibility being placed on her shoulders. I'll take good care of her. We know, the grandfather said. Your actions have already shown us your heart. As the riders prepared to leave, the grandfather pulled something from his saddlebag and walked forward until he was close enough to place it on Martha's porch step. It was a small bundle wrapped in soft leather. For Winter Rose, he explained, things that belong to her mother, so she will not forget where she comes from. Martha picked up the bundle, feeling the weight of history and love wrapped inside it. Thank you. The grandfather mounted his horse and looked back at Martha one more time. In our language, he said, we have a word for someone who saves a child that is not their own. Ina wachingti. It means one who makes herself a mother through love, not blood. He touched his hand to his heart, then gestured toward Martha and Rose. Ina wachingte, he repeated. You are Winter Rose's Ina wachingte now. As the riders disappeared back into the forest, Martha stood on her porch holding Rose and the bundle of her mother's belongings, feeling the weight of the name she'd been given. Ina wachingte, a mother made by choice, not chance. Inside the cabin, Martha unwrapped the leather bundle with trembling fingers. Inside was a small beaded bracelet, a tiny pair of moccasins that Rose would grow into, and a piece of soft deer skin painted with symbols Martha didn't recognize, but somehow understood. These were the things that would teach Rose who she was, where she came from, what her mother had wanted her to become. For now it was enough that Rose was warm and fed and growing stronger by the day. It was enough that her grandfather trusted Martha to keep her safe. It was enough that a lonely cabin had become a bridge between two worlds, a place where love could transcend the boundaries that fear and history had built. Martha settled back into the rocking chair with Rose in her arms, and for the first time since Thomas died, she began to plan for a future that stretched beyond simple survival. Outside, fresh snow began to fall, but inside Martha's cabin, two hearts that had found each other in the storm continued to beat in rhythm, marking time until spring would bring new challenges and new choices. 3 weeks passed before Martha made her first trip to town since finding Rose, and she knew the moment she walked into McDonald's general store that news travels fast in small communities, especially news as unusual as a white widow caring for a Lakota baby. The conversation that had been humming through the store died instantly when Martha entered carrying Rose. She'd wrapped the child in neutral-colored blankets, hoping to avoid immediate recognition of her heritage. But there was only so much that fabric could disguise. Rose had grown in the weeks since Martha found her. The hollow cheeks had filled out, the breathing had strengthened, and those alert dark eyes now tracked faces with the focused attention of a child learning to distinguish friend from stranger. Well, I'll be damned, came a voice from the back of the store. Ezra Hutchins, a man whose talent for spreading news was matched only by his gift for making every story more dramatic than necessary. Martha Caldwell's got herself an Indian baby. Martha felt every eye in the place turned toward her and Rose. She saw the exact moment when polite curiosity transformed into something harder and more dangerous. Now, Ezra, Martha said evenly, shifting Rose to a more comfortable position while maintaining eye contact with the man who'd just made her life infinitely more complicated. This is Rose. She's been staying with me. Staying with you? Mrs. Eleanor Finch, the preacher's wife, stepped forward with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. How charitable of you, Martha. Where exactly did she come from? Martha had prepared for this question, but hearing it spoken aloud in front of witnesses made her realize how inadequate any answer would be. The truth would raise questions about her contact with the Lakota that she wasn't ready to answer. Found her during the big storm, Martha said, sticking close to the truth. Someone had left her near my place, couldn't let a baby freeze to death. Left her? This came from Tom McDonald, the store owner, whose usually friendly demeanor had shifted into something more cautious. Indians don't just leave their babies lying around, Martha. They take care of their own. All I know is I found a child who needed help, and I gave it, Martha replied, her voice carrying a warning that made Tom take a step back. Same as I'd do for any baby, regardless of who its parents were. She was moving toward the counter, determined to complete her business and leave, when Ezra's voice cut through the tension like a rusty blade. Course, there's some might wonder if you didn't steal that baby yourself, Martha. Some might think a lonely widow might do desperate things to fill an empty house. The accusation hit Martha like a physical blow. She turned slowly to face Ezra, Rose still cradled in her arms, and when she spoke, her voice was deadly quiet. Ezra Hutchins, if you ever suggest that I would steal a child from anyone, for any reason, I will make you regret the day you learn to speak. Are we clear? Ezra's bluster faded slightly in the face of Martha's controlled fury, but he wasn't ready to back down entirely. Just saying what others might think, Martha. Having truck with Indians, raising up one of their babies like it was your own. My loyalties, Martha said, her voice rising just enough to ensure everyone could hear clearly, are to doing what's right. If that troubles anyone's sleep, they're welcome to take it up with me directly. She completed her purchases in tense silence, aware that every movement was being cataloged and every word she'd spoken was being memorized for later repetition. When she finally left the store, Rose sleeping peacefully against her shoulder, Martha could feel the weight of a dozen stares following her down the street. The ride back to her cabin gave Martha time to think about what had just happened and what it might mean. Cedar Falls wasn't large, but it was connected to the larger network of settlements and territorial officials that governed this part of Wyoming. Word of her situation would spread, and not everyone who heard it would be as relatively benign as the merchants and farmers she'd face today. She was still wrestling with these concerns when she crested the hill that led down to her property and saw them, 3 horses tied to her fence and 3 men sitting on her porch as if they owned it. Martha recognized 2 immediately. Sheriff William Crawford was decent enough when sober, but he understood which way political winds were blowing. The second man was Lieutenant James Morrison from Fort McKinney, young, earnest, convinced that military discipline could solve any problem if applied with sufficient force. The third man was a stranger, but his expensive clothes and carefully groomed appearance marked him as someone from back east, possibly with connections to the territorial government. Martha approached her own home with a strange feeling that she was walking into a trap, but she kept her expression neutral and Rose's position relaxed. "Gentlemen," she said, dismounting with deliberate calm, "what brings you to my property?" Sheriff Crawford stood up, removing his hat in a gesture that felt more like an apology for what was about to happen. "Martha, we need to talk about that baby." "Rose is sleeping," Martha replied. "I'd prefer not to disturb her if it's not necessary." "I'm afraid it is necessary," the stranger said, stepping forward with the confidence of someone accustomed to having his authority acknowledged immediately. "My name is Charles Whitman. I'm a representative of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and I'm here to discuss the improper custody of a Native American child." Martha felt her heart rate accelerate, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm not sure what you mean by improper custody, Mr. Whitman. I found a dying child and I saved her life. There's nothing improper about that." Whitman's smile was thin and bureaucratic. "Mrs. Caldwell, I'm sure your intentions were admirable, but you're harboring a Native American child without proper authorization. The Bureau has policies regarding the placement of Indian children." "What reasons would those be?" Martha asked, shifting Rose slightly so she could keep both hands free if necessary. "Civilization, Mrs. Caldwell. Education. The opportunity to grow up as a productive member of American society rather than a savage living in teepees." Lieutenant Morrison nodded his agreement. "There are excellent facilities back east, Mrs. Caldwell. Schools specifically designed to educate Indian children in proper American values." Martha had heard about those schools, stories whispered by other settlers, tales of children taken from their families and forbidden to speak their own languages, punished for practicing their customs, taught to be ashamed of everything that made them who they were. "Rose stays with me," Martha said firmly. "Her family knows where she is. They're comfortable with the arrangement." Whitman's expression hardened. Mrs. Caldwell, you seem to be under the impression that you have a choice in this matter. You don't. The child is the property of the United States government by virtue of her race and circumstances. Property? Martha's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. She's a baby, Mr. Whitman, a human being, not property. She's an Indian, Whitman replied coldly. And Indians are wards of the federal government. The law is quite clear. Sheriff Crawford looked uncomfortable. Charles, maybe we don't need to get all legal about this. Martha's been taking good care of the child. Sheriff Crawford, Whitman interrupted, this matter is beyond your jurisdiction. The child will be transported to the Carlisle Industrial School in Pennsylvania. Martha felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Carlisle. She knew that name. It was where native children went and came back changed, if they came back at all. No, Martha said quietly. I beg your pardon? I said no. Martha's voice grew stronger. Rose stays here, with me, where she's safe and loved. Whitman sighed with exaggerated patience. Mrs. Caldwell, interfering with federal Indian policy is a serious crime. You could face imprisonment, loss of your property, complete social ostracism. This isn't about federal policy, Martha replied. This is about Rose. And yes, Mr. Whitman, I'll risk everything for her, because that's what you do for family. Lieutenant Morrison stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his sidearm. Mrs. Caldwell, please don't make this more difficult than necessary. We have the authority to take the child by force. Martha looked at the three men arrayed against her and realized she was facing the same choice her husband had faced when the mountains started to slide. Fight a battle she couldn't win, or find another way to protect what mattered most. Gentlemen, she said slowly, I think there's something you should know before you make any final decisions about Rose's future. What's that? Whitman asked impatiently. Martha smiled, and there was something in her expression that made all three men take an unconscious step backward. You're being watched. Whitman looked around nervously. What do you mean? I mean that Rose's grandfather and several of his warriors have been camped in the valley beyond that ridge for 3 weeks now. They know she's here. They know she's safe. And they're very interested in making sure she stays that way. Lieutenant Morrison's hand moved closer to his weapon. Are you threatening us, Mrs. Caldwell? I'm informing you, Martha replied calmly. You can try to take Rose from me by force, but you should understand that doing so might provoke exactly the kind of Indian trouble that the territorial government has been trying to avoid. Sheriff Crawford looked pale. Martha, you're not saying there's a war party out there. I'm saying that Rose's people care about what happens to her, Martha replied, and they've made it clear that they're watching the situation very closely. The three men exchanged glances, and Martha could see the calculations taking place. The glory of enforcing federal Indian policy was considerably less appealing when it came with the risk of provoking a conflict. Very well, Whitman said finally. I'll wire Washington for clarification. But Mrs. Caldwell, understand that this is only a temporary delay. I understand, Martha replied, and I hope Washington understands the situation they're dealing with here. After the men left, Martha sat on her porch with Rose in her arms, watching the afternoon shadows lengthen. She'd bought time, but at a cost. Now she was committed to a story that might or might not be true, gambling both their safety on the assumption that the Lakota were still nearby and still protective. More importantly, she declared herself publicly as someone willing to defy federal authority to protect a native child. Word of that defiance would spread, and not everyone who heard it would be sympathetic. But as Rose stirred in her arms and opened those alert dark eyes to gaze up at her with complete trust, Martha felt fierce satisfaction settle into her bones. She'd drawn a line in the sand, and she'd made it clear which side of that line she stood on. The consequences would come when they came. For now, Rose was safe, and Martha was exactly where she belonged, between a child and anyone who meant. 2 days after the confrontation with Whitman and his companions, Martha woke to find a single eagle feather placed carefully on her porch railing, its shaft pointing toward the valley where Rose's grandfather was camped. The message was clear. We are here, we are watching, and we remember our promises. Martha had been gambling on the continued presence of Rose's people when she'd made her bold claims to the federal officials. But seeing physical proof of their proximity filled her with both relief and renewed anxiety. If the Lakota were still nearby after nearly a month, it meant they were taking their guardianship of Rose very seriously indeed. She was contemplating these implications while feeding Rose her morning meal when she heard the sound of an approaching wagon. Through her window, she could see Dr. Samuel Harrison climbing down from his buggy, medical bag in hand, and an expression of determined professionalism on his weathered face. Dr. Harrison was one of the few people in Cedar Falls whose opinion Martha genuinely respected. He'd tended to Thomas during his final illness, showing both competence and compassion, and he'd never treated Martha with the condescending paternalism that many men seem to reserve for widows. "Martha," Dr. Harrison called out as she opened her door, "I hope you don't mind an unannounced visit. I was in the area and thought I might check on you and the child." It was a polite fiction. Dr. Harrison's practice was centered in Cedar Falls, 20 miles away, but Martha appreciated the effort to maintain social pleasantries. "Of course, doctor. Please come in." Dr. Harrison entered the cabin and immediately noticed Rose, who was sitting propped up against pillows on Martha's bed, playing with wooden blocks Martha had carved for her entertainment. The baby looked up at the stranger with alert curiosity, showing none of the fearfulness that might be expected from a child who'd been neglected. "This is Rose," Martha said, lifting the baby and holding her with natural ease. "Rose, this is Dr. Harrison. He's a friend." Dr. Harrison approached slowly, extending one finger for Rose to grasp in the traditional greeting between adult and baby. Rose examined the offered digit carefully before wrapping her tiny fist around it with surprising strength, eliciting a smile from the doctor. "She's beautiful, Martha, and clearly thriving under your care." "Thank you," Martha replied, feeling a flush of maternal pride. "She's been growing stronger every day." Dr. Harrison began a gentle examination, checking Rose's reflexes, listening to her breathing, testing her responses to various stimuli. Throughout the process, he maintained a running commentary clearly intended as much for Martha's benefit as for any medical record. "Excellent muscle tone, good color, alert and responsive. Weight appears well within normal range for her age." He paused to look directly at Martha. "Whatever you've been doing, it's working remarkably well." "I've just been treating her like any baby," Martha said, "keeping her warm, fed, clean, talking to her, playing with her, the same things any mother would do." "Indeed." Dr. Harrison completed his examination and settled Rose back onto the bed, where she immediately resumed her play. "Martha, I won't insult your intelligence by pretending this is purely a social call. There's been considerable discussion in town about your situation here." "I imagine there has been. Some of that discussion has reached people in positions of authority, people who are concerned about the implications of your guardianship of a native child." Martha settled into a chair across from the doctor, choosing her words carefully. "What kind of implications?" Dr. Harrison was quiet for a moment, studying Rose with the focused attention of someone making a difficult professional assessment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent decades learning to distinguish between political expedience and medical truth. "Martha, I've been practicing medicine on this frontier for 23 years. I've delivered babies in teepees and log cabins, treated gunshot wounds inflicted by both cavalry soldiers and Lakota warriors, and watched diseases kill children regardless of the color of their parents' skin. In all that time, I've learned that there are only two things that really matter when it comes to caring for children: competence and love." He gestured toward Rose, who had managed to stack 2 blocks on top of each other and was regarding her architectural achievement with obvious satisfaction. "That child shows every sign of receiving both in abundance. She's healthy, happy, and developing normally. More importantly, she's clearly bonded with you in a way that suggests she feels safe and loved. From a medical standpoint, removing her from your care would be not just unnecessary but potentially harmful." Martha felt a surge of gratitude toward this man who was willing to speak truth to power. "However," Dr. Harrison continued, "medicine is not the only consideration in this case. There are legal issues, political concerns, and social pressures that extend well beyond my area of expertise." "Dr. Harrison," Martha said quietly, "if I asked you to put your medical opinion in writing, would you do it?" The doctor was silent for a long moment, weighing the professional and personal risks of taking a public stand on such a controversial issue. Finally, he nodded. Yes, I would. But Martha, you should understand that a medical opinion, however strongly stated, may not be enough to override the other forces at work here. Before Martha could respond, they were interrupted by the sound of multiple horses approaching at speed. Through the window, Martha could see a group of riders cresting the hill. Not the measured approach of officials conducting business, but the urgent pace of people responding to emergency. Dr. Harrison moved to the window beside her, and they watched as 6 men reined in their horses near Martha's fence. She recognized most of them: Sheriff Crawford, Lieutenant Morrison, 2 soldiers from Fort McKinney, and 2 civilians whose expensive clothing marked them as government representatives. Trouble, Dr. Harrison murmured. Martha lifted Rose from the bed, wrapping her in a soft blanket and holding her close. Whatever was about to happen, she wanted the baby to feel as secure as possible. The knock on her door was sharp and peremptory, carrying none of the courtesy that had marked previous visits. Mrs. Caldwell, Lieutenant Morrison's voice was clipped and military. Please open the door immediately. Martha exchanged a glance with Dr. Harrison, who nodded grimly and moved to stand beside her as she approached the door. What can I do for you, Lieutenant? Martha called through the closed door. We have new orders regarding the Indian child, Mrs. Caldwell. Please step outside so we can discuss them. Martha opened the door but remained on the threshold, Rose visible in her arms. The sight of the baby seemed to galvanize the men waiting in her yard, and she could see several of them adjusting their positions in ways that suggested they were preparing for resistance. Mrs. Caldwell, one of the civilians stepped forward. I'm Assistant Territorial Governor James Mitchell. I've been sent here to resolve the situation regarding the illegal custody of a Native American child. There's nothing illegal about caring for an orphan baby, Martha replied. There is when that baby is being held in defiance of federal policy, Mitchell shot back. Mrs. Caldwell, you've had ample time to comply with lawful requests for the surrender of this child. Your continued refusal constitutes obstruction of federal authority. Dr. Harrison moved forward slightly, positioning himself where his presence would be unmistakable. Gentlemen, I've just completed a thorough medical examination of the child. She's in excellent health and clearly receiving appropriate care. From a medical standpoint, there's no reason to disrupt her current placement. Dr. Harrison, Mitchell replied coldly, medical considerations are not the primary issue here. This is a matter of law and policy. What law? Martha demanded. Show me the specific statute that says I can't care for a child who was abandoned and dying. Mitchell pulled a folded document from his coat pocket. Mrs. Caldwell, by order of the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Territorial Government of Wyoming, you are hereby commanded to surrender the Native American child, known as Winter Rose, for placement in an appropriate federal facility. Failure to comply will result in your arrest and prosecution. Martha felt the world narrow to a single point of focus: the weight of Rose in her arms, the steady rhythm of the baby's breathing, the complete trust in those dark eyes that looked up at her with innocent faith. No, Martha said quietly. I beg your pardon? I said no. Martha's voice grew stronger. Rose stays with me. Lieutenant Morrison stepped forward, his hand moving to his sidearm. Mrs. Caldwell, you're in violation of a direct federal order. I'm authorized to use whatever force is necessary. Lieutenant, Dr. Harrison's voice carried a warning. You're talking about using force against a woman holding an infant. I trust you understand the implications. But it was too late for caution. From multiple directions came the sound Martha had been both hoping for and dreading. Hoofbeats, multiple horses, approaching fast with the coordinated precision of a military operation. Everyone in the yard heard it at the same time, and Martha saw the exact moment when official confidence transformed into nervous uncertainty. The sounds were coming from several directions, not just one group of riders, but several converging on her property. Lieutenant Morrison drew his sidearm, and immediately 2 of his soldiers followed suit. Defensive positions, he barked. Wait, Martha called out, stepping fully onto her porch with Rose clutched protectively against her chest. Nobody needs to draw weapons. But the first group of riders had already appeared from the tree line. 5 Lakota warriors on painted horses, moving at a controlled gallop. A second group emerged from the north, and a third from the west, until Martha's property was surrounded by nearly 20 mounted warriors in full battle regalia. At the center of the eastern group rode Rose's grandfather, his paint horse stepping proudly despite the tension. He was dressed for war, feathers in his hair, war paint on his cheeks, a rifle across his saddle, but his posture spoke of control rather than aggression. The grandfather raised his hand, and every warrior stopped moving simultaneously, creating a circle around Martha's property that was clearly deliberate and unmistakably threatening. "Jesus Christ," Sheriff Crawford whispered, his face pale with the realization that his quiet day of enforcing policy had just transformed into a potential massacre. The grandfather rode forward until he was close enough to speak without shouting, but still far enough away to avoid being seen as immediately threatening. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the yard. "We have come for Winter Rose." Lieutenant Morrison raised his pistol, pointing it in the general direction of the grandfather. "You're trespassing. Disperse immediately." The grandfather's eyes flicked dismissively over the lieutenant before focusing on Martha. "Ina Wakinkta," he said formally. "We have watched. We have waited. Now we have come." Martha felt the weight of 20 pairs of eyes focusing on her. Rose stirred in her arms, perhaps sensing the tension, but didn't cry. Instead, she seemed to study the faces around her with the same alert attention she brought to everything. "Grandfather," Martha said, using what she hoped was the appropriate term of respect, "Rose is safe here. She's been cared for and loved." "We know," the grandfather replied. "We have seen your heart. But Winter Rose belongs with her people now." Sheriff Crawford stepped forward, his own weapon drawn but pointed at the ground. "We can't have armed Indians surrounding federal officials. This is an act of war." The grandfather's expression didn't change. "We are not at war, Sheriff. We are protecting our child." "Your child is a ward of the federal government," Mitchell declared, his voice shaking despite his attempts to maintain authority. The grandfather finally looked directly at Mitchell, and there was something in his gaze that made the territorial official take an involuntary step backward. "Your government," the grandfather said slowly, "has taken many of our children, sent them far away to die of loneliness in your schools. We will not let Winter Rose join them." Martha looked around at the faces surrounding her. Government officials determined to enforce policy regardless of human cost. Soldiers prepared to use violence. Lakota warriors ready to die rather than see another child taken. In the middle of it all, Rose continued to rest peacefully in her arms. "Stop," Martha said quietly. When nobody responded, she raised her voice. "Stop!" The authority in her voice made everyone turn their attention to her. "All of you, stop and listen," Martha continued. "I have something to say, and you're all going to hear it before anyone does anything stupid." She stepped forward, still holding Rose, until she was standing in the space between the two armed groups. "This baby's name is Winter Rose. 4 weeks ago, she was dying in a blizzard, and I saved her life. Since then, she's been warm, fed, loved, and protected. She's grown stronger and healthier every day." Martha turned to face Mitchell and the other government officials. "You want to take her away from the only stability she's known since her mother died. Ship her off to some school where she'll be taught to hate everything about where she comes from." She turned to face the grandfather and his warriors. "And you want to take her from the home where she's been cared for and loved, drag her across the territory in winter conditions that could kill her?" Martha looked around at all the armed men, and her voice rose with passionate conviction. "All of you are wrong, every single one of you, because this isn't about federal policy or tribal law or who has the right to decide Rose's future. This is about one little girl who deserves better than to become a symbol in other people's wars." She held Rose up slightly, letting everyone see the baby's calm, alert face. "Look at her," Martha commanded. "Really look at her. She's not a political statement or a legal precedent. She's a baby who needs love and stability, and people who put her welfare above their own agendas." The grandfather was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving from Martha's face to Rose's, then back again. When he spoke, his voice was softer. "What would you choose, Ina Wachinkte?" Martha took a deep breath, knowing her next words would determine not just Rose's future, but her own. "I choose to give Rose the best of both worlds," she said. "Let her stay with me until she's old enough to understand who she is and where she comes from. Let her learn about her Lakota heritage from you and your people. But let her also learn about the world she'll have to navigate as someone who exists between two cultures." The silence that followed was thick with tension and possibility. Martha could hear Rose's soft breathing, the wind in the pine trees, the creak of leather as mounted warriors shifted in their saddles. Finally, the grandfather spoke. "Inawachingta speaks wisdom," he said. "Winter Rose will remain with you, but we will be watching, always watching." It wasn't a perfect resolution, but for now Rose was safe. As the various groups began to disperse, Martha stood on her porch holding Rose and marveling at what had just happened. She'd faced down federal authority and tribal law, all for the sake of a baby who had been a stranger just a month ago. But as Rose gurgled contentedly and curled her tiny fist around Martha's finger, Martha felt fierce satisfaction settle into her bones. She'd drawn a line in the sand, and she'd made it clear which side she stood on. The battles weren't over, but today's victory had bought them time. And time was what they needed most of all. Spring arrived in the Wyoming Territory like a cautious negotiator, testing the ground before committing to stay. Martha watched the snow retreat inch by grudging inch, revealing brown grass that would soon turn green and streams that ran swift with snowmelt. But the most remarkable change wasn't in the landscape. It was in the life that had taken root in her cabin. Rose was walking now, taking unsteady steps between Martha's outstretched arms and the furniture she learned to use for support. At 8 months old, she was ahead of most babies in her development, showing the kind of determined independence that Martha suspected she'd inherited from both sides of her complex heritage. Her vocabulary was expanding too, a mixture of English words, Lakota phrases she'd absorbed during her grandfather's visits, and the universal baby language that transcended all cultural boundaries. The arrangement that had emerged from the tense confrontation weeks earlier had evolved into something unprecedented in the territory's history. Joseph Standing Bear, Rose's grandfather, had finally shared his name, visited regularly, sometimes alone, sometimes with other tribal elders who wanted to ensure that Winter Rose was learning the stories and songs that connected her to her people. These visits had become the highlight of Rose's week. She would babble excitedly when she saw Standing Bear approaching, chattering in her mixture of languages while he taught her traditional games and songs. Martha watched these interactions with wonder, seeing how naturally Rose moved between her two worlds, how completely she belonged to both while being owned by neither. But it wasn't just Rose who was changing. Martha found herself learning as much as she was teaching. Standing Bear had begun sharing stories of Lakota culture, explaining the meanings behind the symbols on Rose's birth blanket, teaching Martha phrases in his language so she could help Rose maintain her connection to her heritage. "The child who walks between two worlds," Standing Bear had said during one of his visits, watching Rose play with toys from both cultures, "carries great responsibility. She must be strong in both, weak in neither." Martha understood what he meant. Rose was becoming something new, not white, not traditionally Lakota, but someone who belonged fully to both communities. It was exactly what Martha had envisioned during that confrontation, but seeing it develop was both more wonderful and more challenging than she'd anticipated. The wonderful part was obvious. Rose was happy, healthy, and surrounded by people who loved her unconditionally. She was learning to see differences in skin color, language, and customs as interesting variations rather than threatening divisions. The challenging part was the growing realization that Rose's very existence questioned fundamental assumptions about racial boundaries that most people in 1882 weren't ready to examine. Every time she successfully navigated between her two worlds, she was living proof that the rigid categories that kept communities separate were artificial constructs rather than natural laws. That made her simultaneously precious and dangerous, depending on who was doing the looking. The danger became clearer in early May, when Martha received an unexpected visitor who represented neither territorial authorities nor tribal leadership, but something potentially more threatening: public opinion. Reverend Marcus Whitfield arrived on a Tuesday morning, driving a buggy that had seen better days and carrying a leather satchel that bulged with papers and pamphlets. Martha recognized his type immediately, a circuit preacher whose authority came not from any official appointment, but from his ability to articulate the fears and prejudices of people who felt their world changing too quickly. "Mrs. Caldwell," Reverend Whitfield announced without preamble, "I've come to discuss the situation regarding the heathen child you've been harboring." Martha, who had been working in her garden while Rose played nearby with smooth stones, straightened slowly and studied her uninvited guest. Whitfield was perhaps 40 with pale complexion that suggested he spent more time indoors studying scripture than ministering to actual people. His clothes were neat but worn, and his eyes held the fervent intensity of someone who'd confused his own opinions with divine revelation. "Rose isn't heathen," Martha replied evenly. "She's a baby, and she's not being harbored. She's being raised with love and care. By a woman who allows savage practices in her home," Whitfield shot back. "I've heard about the Indian visitors, Mrs. Caldwell. I know about the heathen rituals and ungodly teachings that child is being exposed to." Martha glanced at Rose, who had looked up from her play with the alert attention she always showed when adult voices carried tension. The child had learned to read emotional atmospheres with uncanny accuracy. "Reverend Whitfield," Martha said carefully, "I think there may be some misunderstanding about what happens in my home. Rose is being taught to respect both her Lakota heritage and Christian values. There's nothing ungodly about helping a child understand where she comes from." "Where she comes from," Whitfield repeated, his voice rising with evangelical fervor, "is a culture of savagery, superstition, and spiritual darkness. That child's soul is in mortal peril, Mrs. Caldwell." Rose began to whimper at the harsh tone, and Martha immediately moved to pick her up, holding the child protectively. The action seemed to inflame Whitfield further. "Look how she clings to you. That's not natural affection. That's the desperate attachment of a creature who knows she doesn't belong in civilized society." "That's enough," Martha said quietly, but her voice carried a warning that made Whitfield step backward. "You're frightening her." "I'm trying to save her soul, and yours too." Whitfield pulled a pamphlet from his satchel. "I've been documenting the spiritual corruption that occurs when Christian children are exposed to heathen influences." Martha looked at the pamphlet, which bore the lurid title, "The Devil's Harvest: How Savage Practices Corrupt Christian Souls." She'd seen similar publications before, cheap propaganda designed to inflame prejudice rather than inform understanding. "Reverend," she said, her voice growing harder, "I think you should leave now. Mrs. Caldwell, there are Christian families, good, godly families who would be willing to take that child and raise her properly, away from savage influences." Rose began to cry then, perhaps picking up on Martha's rising anger. Martha bounced her gently while keeping her eyes fixed on the preacher. "She stays with me," Martha said firmly, "where she's loved and protected and taught to see all people as children of God." "Mrs. Caldwell," Whitfield's voice took on a patronizing tone, "you're allowing your maternal instincts to cloud your spiritual judgment. That child needs to be saved from the darkness of her heritage." Martha felt something cold and dangerous settle in her chest. She'd faced down federal officials and armed warriors to protect Rose, but this preacher's casual dismissal of the child's worth felt more personally insulting. "Reverend Whitfield," she said, her voice deadly quiet, "I want you to listen very carefully. This child is my daughter in every way that matters. She's been baptized in love, raised in compassion, and taught that God's grace extends to all his children. If you think there's something ungodly about that, then you and I worship very different gods." "Mrs. Caldwell, you're committing blasphemy." "I'm speaking truth," Martha interrupted, "and here's some more truth. If you ever come to my home again and suggest that Rose needs to be saved from people who love her, I will personally introduce you to some very ungodly thoughts about what should happen to men who threaten children." Whitfield's face had gone pale, but he made one final attempt. "Mrs. Caldwell, I'll be praying for your soul, and I'll be sharing my concerns with others who care about the spiritual welfare of our community." "You do that," Martha replied, "and while you're praying and sharing concerns, I'll be here doing what Christians are actually supposed to do, loving a child who needs love." After Whitfield left, Martha sat on her porch with Rose in her lap, trying to calm her racing heart while the baby settled back into contented play. The encounter had shaken her more than she wanted to admit, partly because of the hatred in the preacher's voice, but mostly because she recognized the potential power of his message. Fear was always easier to sell than hope. Hatred was simpler than understanding. She was still processing these troubling thoughts when she heard familiar hoofbeats. Standing Bear appeared, but instead of his usual calm approach, there was urgency in his posture. "Ina Wachingti," he said formally as he dismounted. "We must speak." Martha rose, still holding Rose. "Of course. What's wrong?" Standing Bear's expression was grim. "The preacher who visited you today has been busy. He rode directly to Cedar Falls where he spoke to anyone who would listen about the spiritual danger you're creating." Martha felt her stomach tighten. "How do you know about that already?" "We have friends in your town, Ina Wakington. People who understand that what happens to Winter Rose affects all our futures. They sent word immediately." Martha looked down at Rose, who was playing peacefully with the beaded bracelet that had belonged to her birth mother. "What exactly did Whitfield tell people?" "That you're corrupting a Christian child with heathen practices. That Winter Rose is growing up to be neither white nor Indian, but something unnatural that threatens both communities." Martha closed her eyes, feeling responsibility settling even more heavily on her shoulders. "And people believed him?" "Some did. Others are asking questions. A few are beginning to organize." "Organize for what?" Standing Bear was quiet for a moment. "There will be a town meeting tomorrow night. The subject is the Indian question and community safety. Your name has been mentioned specifically." Martha felt the world tilt. A town meeting meant public debate, official decisions, potential action by authorities. Her private arrangement was about to become a matter of public policy. "Will you be there?" she asked. Standing Bear shook his head. "White men making decisions about Indian children do not welcome Indian voices. But we will be watching, and if they decide to take Winter Rose by force—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Martha understood. The careful balance they'd maintained was about to be tested in ways that could destroy everything they'd built. "Standing Bear," Martha said quietly, "what would you do if you were in my position?" The old man studied her face before answering. "I would remember that Winter Rose belongs to herself before she belongs to any community. And I would ask myself what choice gives her the best chance to grow into a woman who can stand proudly in both worlds." It wasn't the answer Martha had hoped for, but it was the answer she'd expected. Standing Bear understood that Rose's future couldn't be guaranteed by any single decision. It could only be protected by people willing to keep fighting for her right to exist as herself. That evening, after Standing Bear had left and Rose was sleeping peacefully, Martha sat at her kitchen table and tried to prepare for what might be the most important speech of her life. Tomorrow night, she would have to stand before her neighbors and explain why a white widow's love for a Lakota baby was worth protecting. Martha pulled out paper and began to write, searching for words that might save not just Rose's future, but the fragile experiment in understanding they'd all been trying to create. Outside, the Wyoming wind whispered through the pine trees, carrying the scent of snow from the mountains and the promise of storms yet to come. But inside Martha's cabin, a woman who'd learned to love without boundaries prepared to fight the most important battle of her life. The meeting was tomorrow, the test was coming, and Rose slept peacefully, trusting that the people who loved her would find a way to keep her safe in a world that didn't yet understand what she represented. The community hall in Cedar Falls had never held so many people at one time. Martha arrived precisely at 7 o'clock, carrying Rose in her arms and wearing her best dress, the dark blue wool she'd worn to Thomas's funeral. She'd chosen it deliberately, knowing that every detail would be scrutinized by people looking for reasons to justify decisions they'd already made. The hall buzzed with conversation that died abruptly when Martha stepped through the door. She'd expected hostility, but the wave of silence that greeted her was somehow more unnerving. It was the silence of people seeing her not as Martha Caldwell, their neighbor, but as a symbol of everything they feared about their changing world. Rose, now 9 months old, surveyed the crowd with alert curiosity. She'd grown into a beautiful child, round-cheeked and bright-eyed, with an infectious laugh that had charmed even reluctant visitors. Tonight she seemed to sense the tension, but simply studied the faces around her with focused attention. Martha found a seat in the middle of the hall, deliberately avoiding both the front rows where she might seem demanding and the back where she might appear to be hiding. From the center, she could see everyone who might speak for or against her, and everyone could see Rose clearly. Reverend Whitfield sat in the front row with a thick folder of pamphlets. He'd gathered supporters around him, people Martha recognized as vocal opponents of any accommodation with the territory's native population. But Martha was encouraged to see friendly faces scattered throughout the crowd. Dr. Harrison sat near the middle, medical bag at his feet. Mrs. Eleanor Sutton from the boarding house had claimed a strategic seat. Even Tom McDonnell from the general store was there. The meeting was called to order by Mayor Franklin Pierce, a portly man whose primary qualification for office was his ability to avoid taking positions on controversial issues. Tonight, however, neutrality wouldn't be possible. Ladies and gentlemen, Mayor Pierce began, we're here to discuss a situation that has implications for our entire community. Mrs. Martha Caldwell has been caring for a Native American child for several months, and there are questions about whether this arrangement serves the best interests of the child, Mrs. Caldwell, and our community. He gestured toward Martha, who rose slightly and nodded before settling back with Rose in her arms. We'll hear from various community members, then discuss what actions, if any, should be taken. I ask that everyone remain respectful and remember we're talking about a child's welfare. Reverend Whitfield was first to speak, rising with theatrical flourish. Mayor Pierce, ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice carrying rolling cadences. We are gathered here to confront a crisis of moral and spiritual proportions that threatens the very foundation of our Christian community. He opened his folder and pulled out a pamphlet, holding it high for everyone to see. For months, we have allowed a well-meaning but misguided woman to conduct an experiment in racial mixing that flies in the face of God's natural order. We have watched as a Christian home has been open to heathen practices and savage influences. Martha felt Rose stir as Whitfield's voice rose, and she gently bounced the baby while keeping her expression neutral. She'd expected this rhetoric, but hearing it spoken publicly still felt like a physical blow. The child in question, Whitfield continued, gesturing toward Martha and Rose, is being raised in spiritual confusion that can only lead to moral degradation. She is being taught to embrace heathen practices alongside Christian values, creating a dangerous hybrid that threatens the purity of both traditions. Murmurs of agreement rippled through his supporters, but Martha noted that much of the crowd remained silent and attentive. More troubling still, Whitfield pressed on, is how this situation has created dangerous precedents for relations between our community and the savage tribes around us. By treating this child as equal to a white Christian baby, we are undermining the natural hierarchy that God established between the races. Dr. Harrison rose from his seat. Point of order, Mayor Pierce. Are we here to discuss theology or the welfare of a specific child? Pierce looked flustered but nodded toward the doctor. You'll have your chance when the Reverend is finished. I'm finished now, Whitfield declared, annoyed but smart enough to recognize he was losing his audience's attention. I move that this community demand the immediate removal of the Indian child from Mrs. Caldwell's home and her placement in an appropriate federal facility. A scattered chorus of second came from Whitfield's supporters, but the response was less enthusiastic than Martha had feared. Is there discussion? Mayor Pierce asked nervously. Dr. Harrison stood immediately. I'd like to present medical evidence relevant to this discussion. He pulled a thick folder from his medical bag and opened it to reveal handwritten notes. I've been monitoring this child's development for 6 months, he announced with professional authority. I've documented her physical growth, cognitive development, emotional responses, and overall health. I'm prepared to testify that she shows every sign of receiving exceptional care. The doctor looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as possible. This child is healthy, happy, and developing normally in every measurable way. She's ahead of most children her age in motor skills and language development. She shows no signs of neglect, abuse, or developmental delays. From a medical standpoint, disrupting her current placement would be not just unnecessary, but potentially harmful. Eleanor Sutton stood up. Dr. Harrison, what about claims that she's being exposed to dangerous influences? Mrs. Sutton, I've observed this child's interactions with people from both white and Native communities. She shows no signs of confusion, fear, or distress. If anything, she seems unusually comfortable with diversity, which I consider a positive trait in a territory where different communities must learn to coexist. Tom McDonald rose next. Doctor, what's your professional opinion about the long-term effects of this arrangement? Dr. Harrison was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Mr. McDonald, I believe this child is being prepared for a future that most of us can barely imagine. She's learning to navigate multiple cultures, multiple languages, multiple ways of seeing the world. Those are skills that could make her extraordinarily valuable as a bridge between communities that have been at war for generations. Sheriff Crawford spoke from the back. Dr. Harrison, that's interesting from a medical standpoint. But what about practical concerns? We've got federal authorities asking questions, tribal leaders making demands, and community members getting stirred up. How long can this continue without someone getting hurt? Dr. Harrison looked directly at Martha before answering. Sheriff, I think that depends on whether we choose to see this child as a problem to be solved or as an opportunity to be embraced. Mayor Pierce looked increasingly uncomfortable. Perhaps we should hear from Mrs. Caldwell herself. Martha had been preparing for this moment for days, but as she stood with Rose in her arms, her carefully rehearsed speech evaporated. Instead, she found herself speaking from the heart. Most of you know me, she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. You knew my husband, Thomas. You know we came here to build something good, something lasting. You know we were the kind of people who helped neighbors in trouble and asked for help when we needed it. She looked around the room, making eye contact with familiar faces. When Thomas died, this community rallied around me. You helped me through the hardest time of my life, and I'll never forget that kindness. So when I tell you about Rose, I'm not asking you to trust a stranger. I'm asking you to trust someone you've known for years. Martha adjusted Rose's position so more people could see her clearly. I found this baby dying in a blizzard. She was blue with cold, barely breathing, abandoned by circumstances I'll never fully understand. I brought her inside, warmed her up, and watched her come back to life in my arms. In that moment, she stopped being an Indian baby and started being Rose, a child who needed love and got it. Rose babbled something that sounded almost like Mama, causing soft laughter through parts of the crowd. Since then, Martha continued, Rose has been visited regularly by her grandfather and other tribal family members. They've taught her songs and stories that connect her to her heritage. They've made sure she knows where she comes from and who her people are. But they've also trusted me to give her something else. Knowledge of the world she'll have to navigate as someone who exists between two cultures. Martha's voice grew stronger. Rose speaks English and Lakota. She's comfortable with white visitors and native visitors. She's learning that differences in skin color and customs don't make people enemies. They make them interesting. She's growing up to be exactly what this territory needs. Someone who can build bridges instead of walls. A voice from Whitfield's section called out, "What about her Christian education? What about her immortal soul?" Martha turned toward the voice, calm but determined. Rose has been baptized by love every single day since I found her. She's learning that God's grace extends to all his children, regardless of the color of their skin or the language they speak. She's growing up knowing that the most important commandment is to love one another. If that's not Christian education, then I don't understand what Christianity means. The hall fell silent as Martha's words settled over the crowd. She could see people exchanging glances, whispered conversations, subtle shifts suggesting minds were being changed. Mayor Pierce cleared his throat. Mrs. Caldwell, what would you say to people who worry that your arrangement sets a dangerous precedent? Martha had prepared for this question. Mayor Pierce, I'd say that love is never irregular. Care is never dangerous. The precedent I hope I'm setting is that when a child needs help, good people provide it, regardless of politics or prejudice. She looked around the room once more. But more than that, I'd say that Rose represents something this territory desperately needs. Proof that we don't have to choose between preserving our traditions and adapting to change. She's growing up as both Lakota and American, and she's thriving because of it, not despite it. Martha paused for her most important argument. Ladies and gentlemen, we're living in a time when two peoples who've been at war for generations are trying to figure out how to share the same land. We can keep fighting, keep building walls, keep teaching our children to fear and hate each other, or we can try something different. We can raise children who see diversity as strength rather than threat. Rose gurgled softly and reached for faces around her, causing several people to smile. That's what Rose represents, Martha concluded. Not a threat to our way of life, but a hope for a better way of life. Not confusion about who she is, but clarity about who we could all become if we chose love over fear. Martha sat down to scattered applause that gradually grew stronger. It wasn't unanimous support, but it was far more encouraging than she'd dared hope. Reverend Whitfield rose again, frustrated by the positive response. Ladies and gentlemen, we must not allow sentiment to cloud our judgment. This child may appear healthy now, but what about her future? What happens when she reaches maturity and becomes confused about her identity? Dr. Harrison stood before Whitfield could continue. Reverend, with respect, you're asking us to make decisions based on hypothetical future problems rather than observable present realities. This child shows no signs of confusion, violence, or immorality. She shows signs of being loved, educated, and prepared for a complex world. Eleanor Sutton joined the discussion. What about the political implications the Sheriff Crawford raised? Mrs. Sutton, I believe the political implications of removing this child from a loving home would be far more dangerous than allowing her to remain where she's thriving. An unexpected voice spoke up. Mrs. Catherine Mills, an elderly widow who'd lost her own children years earlier. I'd like to say something, if I may. Pierce nodded toward her. I've lived in this territory for 37 years, Mrs. Mills began, her voice thin but clear. I've seen wars, diseases, droughts, floods, and every other kind of hardship. I've buried children, buried husbands, buried dreams, and in all that time, I've learned one thing for certain. Love is rare and precious, and when you find it, you protect it. She gestured toward Martha and Rose. That baby has found love. Real love. The kind that changes people and makes them better. Now we're talking about destroying that love in the name of what? Politics? Prejudice? Fear? Mrs. Mills' voice grew stronger. I've seen what happens to children raised without love, shipped off to institutions where they're treated like problems instead of people. I've seen the emptiness in their eyes, the hardness in their hearts. Do we really want to inflict that on a child who's currently surrounded by people who would die to protect her? The hall was completely silent, and Martha could see tears in several eyes. I move to table Reverend Whitfield's motion indefinitely, Mrs. Mills declared, and I move that we officially recognize Mrs. Caldwell's guardianship of Rose, with the understanding that she'll continue to receive support from both our community and the child's tribal family. Second, Dr. Harrison called out immediately. Second, Eleanor Sutton echoed. Second, Tom McDonnell added. Mayor Pierce looked stunned by the sudden shift. Is there discussion of Mrs. Mills' motion? Reverend Whitfield rose one final time, his face flushed with anger. This is madness. You're allowing sentiment to override Scripture. You're choosing earthly compassion over divine commandment. Dr. Harrison stood calmly. Reverend, I believe the consequences of this decision will echo through this territory in ways that prove love is stronger than fear, understanding is stronger than prejudice, and hope is stronger than hate. Mayor Pierce called for a vote on Mrs. Mills' motion. The result wasn't unanimous, but it was decisive. 27 in favor, 11 opposed, with 3 abstentions. Martha felt her knees go weak with relief as the numbers were announced. Rose had been babbling quietly throughout the proceedings, occasionally reaching toward familiar faces, completely unaware that her future had just been decided by a room full of strangers who'd chosen love over fear. As people began filing out, many stopped to speak with Martha, some offering congratulations, others asking questions about Rose's development, a few simply wanting to get a closer look at the child who'd become the center of so much controversy. Dr. Harrison was among the last to leave. Martha, he said quietly, what happened here tonight was remarkable. You didn't just win a vote, you changed minds. You helped people see beyond their fears to possibilities they'd never considered. Dr. Harrison, Martha replied, I couldn't have done this without your support. Your medical testimony gave people a factual basis for making an emotional decision. Perhaps, but Martha, you should understand that this victory doesn't resolve all the challenges you'll face. Federal authorities may not respect local decisions. Some tribal community members may have concerns, and there will always be people like Whitfield who see your success as a threat. Martha looked down at Rose, who had fallen asleep in her arms during the excitement. I know, doctor, but tonight proved something important. There are more people willing to choose love over fear than I dared to hope. That gives me strength for whatever comes next. The ride home through the cool Wyoming night gave Martha time to process what had happened. She'd entered the evening knowing that her neighbors would decide Rose's future, and she'd left with official recognition of her right to raise the child she'd come to love as her own daughter. As Martha carried the sleeping child into their cabin and settled her into the familiar crib, she reflected on how much had changed since that desperate night when she'd heard a baby crying in the blizzard. Rose had grown from a dying infant into a thriving toddler, comfortable in multiple worlds and loved by people from different cultures. Martha had evolved from a lonely widow into something she'd never expected, a bridge between communities that had been at war for generations. Most importantly, their small family had become proof that love could transcend the boundaries that politics and prejudice had created. Rose was growing up as both Lakota and American, learning to see differences in culture and appearance as interesting variations rather than threatening divisions. Outside, the Wyoming winds sang through the pine trees, but inside Martha's cabin, two hearts that had found each other in the storm continued to beat in rhythm, marking time until the next test of their bond would come. Rose slept, and Martha watched over her, and the wind sang lullabies through the eaves of a cabin that had become a fortress built not of logs and stones, but of love and determination, and the unshakable belief that some bonds were worth any sacrifice to preserve. And so, in the unforgiving wilderness of Wyoming territory, a blizzard that should have been an ending became a beginning. Martha Caldwell discovered that motherhood isn't about blood, it's about the courage to love when someone needs you most. Winter Rose grew up to become something the frontier had never seen, a living bridge between two worlds. She spoke English and Lakota, moved between settlements and tribal camps, carrying the stories of both her heritage and her chosen home. Rose became a translator of more than languages. She translated cultures, helping communities understand each other. Her children and grandchildren carried forward Martha's lesson, that differences make people interesting, not threatening. When Martha died at 78, her funeral was attended by people from dozens of communities, proof that love really can transcend the boundaries fear builds. Their legacy lives on in every person who chooses compassion over indifference, hope over despair. Martha was just an ordinary woman who made an extraordinary choice on one desperate night. She had no special training, just a heart open enough to hear a cry for help and respond with love. What would you have done if you'd heard that baby crying in the blizzard? More importantly, what will you do the next time life asks you to choose love over fear? Sometimes the most precious treasures are found in unexpected places. Sometimes the most extraordinary families are created by choice, not chance. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced a moment when someone's kindness changed everything? When you discovered that family could be built on love rather than blood? Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Stories for more incredible tales of courage and compassion. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that might remind you love really can conquer fear. Until next time, remember, every storm passes, but the love we share in the shelter lasts forever.